Hello, everybody. My name is Mark Boulay. I'm a data scientist with Synovus Energy. On behalf of Tim Chan, I would like to welcome you to our second Untapped Energy meetup of 2021 on Introduction to Data Management.
I want to start by thanking everyone for letting ITIQ be a part of this community. This is the market update for February 2021. We haven't been seeing too much of a change from the development side of things, but a huge requirement or set of requirements that we've been receiving across the nation, across Canada, has been for cybersecurity specialists. It's been critical. A lot of companies are really struggling to not only hire but retain cybersecurity specialists, primarily the senior resources. We're going to go through a little bit of that today. And then as well, we've been seeing it like we've been seeing for the last essentially 2 years, a huge demand for web and mobile development, primarily using Node.js as backend technology with JavaScript on the front end, React, Angular, Vue, all that good stuff. So that hasn't changed much, which is why I really want to focus on the cybersecurity aspect of it today. Because as I mentioned, it's been blowing up across the country. And I actually heard a really interesting story from a senior project manager that deals in cybersecurity. He mentioned that someone tried to hack the water supply in one of the states in America, that is, and tried to regulate the amount of fluoride going into the water supply. So really, really scary stuff. It seems that, as we go through this new world of, COVID restrictions, more and more people have a lot of time on their hands, and it seems like hackers are just having their way with a lot of these companies, private and public sector. So it's very, very serious, and there's a great deal of demand across the nation and in the United States. So primarily cybersecurity for project managers, business analysts, cybersecurity architects, cloud architects. IAM stands for Identity Access Management, and then network security. And the biggest challenges that employers are finding is that once they hire these individuals, they're unable to retain them, and they're unable to flip them to a permanent employment, meaning the majority of these individuals prefer to be contractors. And, they essentially like to do specific projects and then go on to the next thing. And I'm going to explain why a little bit later here, but these are essentially the biggest requirements that we're seeing in cybersecurity as of right now. So if you go ahead and you look at these rates, and these are the average rates across the nation, a cybersecurity architect is at $148 an hour. That's actually probably a little bit lower than what I would have expected to see. I would say they're about that $160 per hour. And then you'll notice the average base salary is about $163,000. Now, the reason that, an architect or a cloud architect or any one of these individuals' specializations, the reason that they would want to remain as contractors is, although as a permanent employee, you're going to receive the full benefits, paid time off, healthcare benefits, so on and so forth. On average, you're going to be working about 2,000 hours in a year. And if you do the quick math there, even at $98 an hour, a network security specialist will essentially double their salary as a contractor. And so this has been the primary concern of all of our clients and the clients of other agencies as well, is that it's really hard to lock these individuals down long term. Because the difference in what they're earning is tremendous from a contractor base to a permanent employee. So if you look at this, I mean, the prices are quite high, and rightfully so. I mean, these individuals are highly, highly specialized in their respective areas.
Sorry, Khaled, are those numbers in Canadian or US?
Well, those are Canadian dollars. Those are Canadian. This is a Canadian survey that was put out. So yeah, that's essentially it. I mean, from a cybersecurity aspect, there again has been a huge demand, and companies are really struggling to find individuals that are willing to stay. So and another thing that I want to quickly point out as well is cybersecurity and AI they are starting to become more and more related because you can automate the way that you can test the security of a specific application or a set of applications. So there is a tie between cybersecurity and AI, and we're going to continue to see this grow. It's going to be mostly along the automated testing using AI to test platforms to ensure that they're secure. So that was essentially it. Did anyone have any questions about this before I move forward?
There's one other question in the chat from Michelle. She was asking how many years of work experience are required for these types of salaries?
That's a wonderful question. So a cybersecurity architect, you won't find someone less than 15 years of experience. They're usually about 20 to 30 years, and they've probably been doing it their entire career. They more often than not start in network security. It really depends on which specialization you're looking at. These are senior rates, so usually senior is anywhere 8+ years. Sometimes it'll be 10, but it's usually 8+ years worth of experience. Even the intermediate rates are very, very strong. But to answer your question, it's usually these are senior rates.
And is there a formal education path, or are all these folks just reformed hackers?
No, there is a formal education path. I know SATE offers a ton of ethical hacking and penetration testing courses. They do have a network security course as well, but once you get into the more senior, like into the architect level, the SOX level, they're mostly certificates that you do an ad hoc, through various universities or programs. That being said, my understanding of these certificates they are incredibly challenging. It's not an easy specialization, not by any means. It's very, very complex, very intricate. I hope
yeah, absolutely, thank you. And Krang has a question, I guess. How long do you think that these the demand will be out there for these roles?
It's only going to grow. It is really, truly only going to grow. What I would say is that even right now where we stand, there is a massive shortage. Much like strong web developers, there's a massive shortage. But in this instance, these individuals are really highly sought after because oftentimes what they're protecting is highly, highly privileged information. In the hack that I was referring to earlier, the gentleman that I was talking to, the senior project manager, obviously if that individual successfully hacked the water supply, the consequences would have been absolutely dire because the fluoride, once you add a certain amount of fluoride into the water, it becomes essentially toxic. And it just destroys the human body. So there are very, very serious consequences associated with not having a strong cybersecurity team in place for any organization.
Just to give a little color on that, I was actually chatting with one of the IT folks in my organization, and he said that we typically get tens of thousands of hits against our firewall every day. And it starts early morning, right when China wakes up, you start getting hits, then it goes through Russia, a little bit of a break then it hits Brazil, and then there's an 8-hour break as it goes through the Pacific, then starts all over again every day. And so, yeah, they're extremely paranoid about this, and I can appreciate that now.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. I think with this particular, like with the pandemic and everything that's been going on, it's just elevated the requirement for it because, again, a lot more people are sitting at home and trying to break into these systems for their own malevolent purposes. It's a very scary time in that aspect. So having a shortage makes it even scarier, having the shortage of actually qualified individuals that can go in there and assist these organizations. But yeah, you're right. It's an all-day thing. If you look at it, especially the bigger the organization, the harder the attacks are. But I know for a fact there was a ransomware. I won't say the client, but it's a Calgary-based company. I think it was a $30 million ransomware placed on their application, which is a funding application. It funds various loans and investments. And, the entire company shut down. It was not a joke. The entire company shut down. The workers couldn't work. People were out of jobs. It was just very, very scary.
Thanks once again for that. Really appreciate it. So now we'll move on to the keynote presentation featuring Carter Edie, who is currently a business intelligence engineer at Chatters Limited Partnership. And if you haven't read his biography, he has 3 data parts. He's a data renaissance man, and I know him from his second data role when we were both in the geophysical industry in Calgary. And but he's done a lot of pretty awesome things, both in astronomy, in geophysics, and now he's in the new data analytics world. And I think he's had some really great experiences. I'm very excited to hear about his experience and introduction to data change management.
Hi everyone. First off, thanks for allowing me to come and talk here. Apologies again if you hear some kids running around upstairs. It's just part of life now, being at home, and I think they're on their way upstairs right now. But no, I greatly appreciate it. As Mark said, I knew him from before when I was in the geophysical processing world. We had connected a couple of times on a project or two, and just trying to push the boundaries of geophysical data at that time. And a lot of transfer of knowledge and experience has gone from the geophysics and geology worlds into data analytics and data science. And I've had a lot of good conversations over the last couple of years of what that looks like from my perspective and my background, but also how people can transition those skills into a data analytics or a data analyst role, and a whole bunch of other roles that are now burgeoning in the data space. And one of the things that I like to focus on after doing my MBA in entrepreneurship is, how do we take those previous examples and previous experiences that we had and actually convince people from a technical standpoint that what we've done before matters. And it's a big question. It's hard because you want to relate your experiences, but you don't actually know where to start. And data, from the outset, there's so many different places you can go in data and so many different roles that it's hard to kind of transition those experiences and those aspects that you've done before. So focusing on something that is a broad base, like data change management, for instance, is not something that comes up all that often, but in our businesses, in our world, data change management actually, or just change management in general, is something that affects a lot of people. So I'm going to just kind of jump in here and start my presentation. So, what I'm going to start off with is, let's see if this will go. Okay. So I wanted to start off with something that was quite abstract. And what I see here is a bunch of random circles of different colors. But in our data worlds, we see data as columns and fields and tabs and all these different sources where we can get databases and transformations and KPIs and so forth. I wanted to point out, kind of with the visualization of this, is you might see a randomness to the image here, to the artistic image here of all these different circles. Somebody else would see this as what we see as data, right? It all comes down to perspective and context of how you're viewing a certain domain or a certain aspect or component. And we have to start thinking not just in our world of data, of logic and analytics and very focused analytical thinking, but also where other people are coming from with different context. And I wanted to start off with a story about a guy I worked with at WestJet. His name was Frank. And when I started there, I've only been kind of in the analytics world really for the last 3 or 4 years after kind of finishing off in geophysics and moving into going on to do my MBA and getting into data analytics. But Frank had been there for a while at WestJet, and he was in the group that I started out in. And he was kind of more of a senior analytics person, and was tasked with building a new KPI dashboard. The current problem was that there wasn't a readily available way, a succinct and easy way to determine whether or not a flight was an outlier or an exception compared to other flights. And we're talking about tens of thousands of flights per day. Obviously, this was before COVID, but but there really wasn't a way of bringing all this information together on a daily basis as being updated and really do outlier detection. So, he went out and gathered all the KPIs and looked through all the data that was necessary and formed, a business user case for what was necessary for this new dashboard that he was going to build. So he got all the data sources he needed. He went through the data discovery process, built a custom ELT process, which could then be automated on a daily basis and be ready for people in people's hands at the beginning. So, a real kind of end-to-end delivery project in the analytics space. He built a minimum viable product and then started to test it with users, bring them into user groups. He started to get leaders and test it out with leaders, test it out with the users at the users end, and get some feedback. And from that feedback, he created iterations of the product. And then once, he was ready he published it up to the server and ran some user courses on how to use the dashboard. And, he was really, really happy about the end result. And, he thought this was really going to make a big change for how people are going to be able to find exceptions and price out apply new pricing models to these exceptions. But there was just one problem. After a couple of months, he went back and checked with the system administrator for the dashboard system to see who was viewing it, and nobody was using it. Not a single person. Well, there might have been a couple of people here and there. It was kind of checking out, but it was very underutilized for the purpose. And we have to ask ourselves what went wrong in this whole process. There was a lot of time and effort and experience that went into it, but how did it not work? And so I wanted to come up with a stat and show everybody that something that's out there in the space is 70% of change management projects fail. And I'll get into the details of what a change management project actually is or what change management actually means in a couple of slides. But it's I want you to think about that stat, 70% of change management projects fail. And then kind of think, was it somebody who was kind of at Harvard Business Review who said this? Was this a business leader, Larry Ellison at Oracle, or maybe it was Elron who talked about this, or Elon Musk. But no, I want to bring back in that idea of context. And the people that quote 70% of change management projects fails are experts. And this was developed in a paper called Re-Engineering of the Corporation back in 1993. And this stat is brought and trotted out all the time by, let's say, large consultancy firms that want to get engaged with change management projects. And 70% is, it's such a big number that it really grasped hold of your imagination of why do all of these projects fail if change management has been around for a long time and change management processes have been established. And kind of just like many of our data initiatives, most important thing to take into consideration when we're talking about a number like this is context. What's behind that? And the definition of where the 70% came from was that 70% of the initiatives were not considered home runs by their managers, leaders, or the people that were implementing them. And anybody who has tried to implement any sort of project that's new or that has to change norms and regulations of how an organization works, you'll never, for the most part, hit a home run. I mean, 30%. That's a batting average in baseball, to fall back on kind of my baseball days. 30% is actually a good batting average if you take the flip side of that to get on base or have a hit. But instead, if we reframe that, 60% of initiatives were somewhere between a base hit and a home run. So maybe you got a little ways of the way there. Maybe you were able to build the ELT flow that gave you a data set, but you weren't quite able to get a foothold on the actual reporting structure at the end. Or maybe you were able to discover something else in the process steps that ended up benefiting another part of the organization. So there's varying degrees of what actually success can be with a change management project. And I should say that these change management projects in the context is not specifically for IT or data initiatives, but it's for all of the projects that were surveyed for this particular study. And in reality, only 10% were considered actual strikeouts, so complete failures. So 90% had some sort of benefit to the organization, but yet this 70% of change management projects failed number gets trotted out all the time. And it's no wonder that, we in organizations, hear the words change management, and you kind of get a little bit concerned about what's going on. And this was all put out in a Harvard Business Review article talking about how organizational change is hard, and we need to stop using that as a context for not doing it, but realize that the harder you work and the more things you have to do for creating something that is sustainable, the more stickiness it might have. Okay, so we think analytically, I would say, and I mean, I'm speaking kind of in broad terms here, but for the most part in our space, we think in data, right? Just like that image that I showed before, that picture, that painting before with all the rings, we think in data. We think in columns, we think in tables, we think in views, we think in data warehouses, we think in transformations. But we have to start considering the other context of who is using our data, and more so, what perspective are they coming at with the data themselves? So, where does the data fit within the people of our organization, within the groups, within the divisions, within the leaders? How are the leaders going to use it? How does the organization as a whole, do we have a data strategy overall, or are there pockets of data strategies that are kind of conflicting? But in reality, it's just like a lot of things that we do. It's formed around habits, routines, and norms. And getting people to change those is very difficult. It's not an easy task to get somebody to do a new thing, or try a new thing, or start to utilize a new thing. So we have to kind of start to think in the process of change. And that's where change management comes in, change management theory. And what change management theory is, and this is used, you'll start to hear terms that you might have seen before when you're within an organization that might have come out of maybe a new project initiative, or maybe it's come from human resources, for instance, because I would say that human resources has probably been one of the divisions within organizations that has used this the most successfully of using these techniques to institute or install change within an organization. It's the process organizations launch to improve current performance, seize new opportunities, or address key issues. And that's pretty broad, which is great because you can distill it down to very specific change techniques that you want to install, or more for organizational change. I'm sure people have heard the term that it's really hard to turn a ship, right? And that's a key component about change management. The larger the organization is, the more institutionalized beliefs, norms, and routines exist, the harder it is to get something new on board. And so just keep that in mind when you're kind of working through these change processes, whether or not it's installing a new type of server, or bringing in a new data warehouse, bringing things to the cloud, which has been popular lately, or bringing in even a new dashboard, a new data to be able to use. So change management involves plans, projects, and initiatives. And a little personal story, going out to do my MBA and actually taking a path away from geophysics, I ended up going to do my MBA for a couple of reasons. One of the main ones was to start to understand a little bit better why organizational decisions were being made. And I know there's a lot of externalities and a lot of outside pressure that exists that, as an employee, maybe you don't see. But even things like initiatives that were taken or might have been taken within the organizations while I was there, I wanted to understand a little bit better, maybe the business perspective behind why that was happening. And a lot of these things keep coming up again: plans, projects, and initiatives. Just the focus on organizations of how you instill those or kick those off are, you start to think as how, managers or leaders would start to install each one of those, and then you can realize how you're part of that whole process. Change management really is about the human side of change and how people react, because our organizations truly are the sum of all the people that are working in them. We produce products, we sell things, we produce energy, or we fly planes, some of us sometimes. But addressing the human side of how an organization works is really the component that's the one of the main pillars. And along those lines, the very crucial pillar of instituting change is employee communication. How are you communicating, what change is entailing and what you have to do to get change initiated? with employees is going to be key to whether or not they are successful at any one of the steps, or whether or not you have one of those 10% strikeouts. So I'm going to jump back into kind of some of the most established models in the change management space. And as the bio or the overview said of my talk, there have been at least 4 decades of intense implementation of change management models within organizations all over the world. You know, there are seminars, and there's even a certification for change management. And these models really represent kind of not only from the employee experience response, as the Cotters Model is, through to implementation impact response of the McKinnon S7S Model, to process gap identification response of the AdCar Model, to the Kübler-Ross employee reaction response. These range of what is the perspective of the context that change is affecting individuals and the structures of the organization. So if we wanted to talk a little bit of maybe examples that you might have heard of before for each one of these models, you know, with the Cotters Model, if you've ever had lean initiatives or command center projects that have been established within your organization, that's an implementation of the Cotters Model, where you're starting to figure out how different parts of the organization have an employee experience reaction to the change across it. You know, if you're going to implement a new CRM tool or a new CRM software within your organization, you probably will go through the McKinnon S7S Model. And I'll detail a little bit more which each one of these is as we go forward, just so you can see and get familiar with, you know, what each component of these models actually show, so that you can then tie back to some of the experiences or some of the things that you're seeing within your own organizations. If you've ever been included in a work group to identify industry best practices, that's straight out of an AdCar model, where you're trying to identify where your organization may have gaps compared to the rest of the industry. Or, and we'll get to this one, I think everybody will be familiar with the Kübler-Ross 5-stage model when we actually go through it. If you've ever had an emotional reaction to something, and I'm hoping everybody on this call has had an emotional reaction to something, you've gone through some stage of the 5-stage model, and we can think of change as an emotional response when it's talking about groups of employees or groups of stakeholders. So what is the Cotters Model? The Cotters Model has been cultivated from over 4 decades of Dr. Cotters' observations of leaders and organizations attempting to transform or execute strategies within their organizations. So refining the methodology has created these key success factors, such as when you're kicking off a new project or when you want to install change within an organization, you create a sense of urgency around the project. You know, get people mobilized, get people engaged. You build a guiding coalition, or a group of individuals. Sometimes it's called a volunteer army, of individuals that have like-mindedness towards achieving the goal. You form a strategic vision that this volunteer army can rally around and coalesce around. So, again, you've probably heard rowing all in the same direction. You want your leaders, and that doesn't necessarily mean managerial leaders, but leaders of the initiative, to have a strategic vision that they fall back upon when doing the process building or doing the changing. Again, you listen a volunteer army, you get people that share a same sense of accomplishment or same sense of direction. Enable actions to remove barriers for change. And I mean, you might maybe in some of your meetings or daily check-ins at your organization, you've heard of, do you have a roadblock in place, or are you finding that there's not the data that you need for this project? What are the actions available to remove the barriers proactively rather than getting stalled out on a project? A big one that I like to institute a lot is generate short-term wins, where you just generally show successes right off the bat and you share it with people. No success is too small, because you're trying to build momentum. The end goal is a bunch of small little steps, and you want to make sure that everybody is aware of the successes that are happening. And then it's sustained acceleration. So when you celebrate those small successes, it keeps people motivated. And I'll show you in the Kübler-Ross model that there's a time component, obviously, to all of these projects and processes and plans. And then finally, you institute change. So it's a big list of steps that you have to go to first. And it's not just, come up with a brilliant idea and innovate. Whenever you're going through a new project, a new process or plan, you kind of see each one of these steps. Maybe not explicitly. Maybe you're not laying out each one of the plans and saying we got to get to this step or this step or this step. But I'm pretty sure that when a lot of people on this call or have gone through creating a new project or going through some sort of change, you've seen these components. You've all felt them, I'm sure. What is the McKinnon S7S model? So McKinsey came out in the late 1987s. There were a couple of consultants named Peter and Waterman, and they developed a framework which maps the interrelated factors that influence an organization's ability to change. So this is much more structural in nature rather than more process driven, as we saw before with Cotters. This is much more structural of the organization itself and what's the willingness of the organization and the employees to change. So what's the strategy around it? And you'll notice that it's all 7 S's. Structure of the organization, what systems are in place, and are there challenges to instituting change because of the systems? Do those need to get looked at? What shared values exist within the organization? You can almost call that a data culture now, which is a big focus of a lot of publication literature right now. And employees about change. You need to have people, the skills that exist. I just got a message that my internet is a little bit unstable. Is everybody still reading me? Is this okay?
Yeah, Carter, we can still hear you. Yeah, there's just a little bit of lag, but I think
Okay.
It's caught up now. Yeah.
Okay. The thrills of working from home and everybody being on at Netflix. What is it? It's 6 o'clock at night. And the skills that exist within the organization, like not only individual skills, do you have the right pieces in place? Do you have the right people available as resources to institute a new project or change? But also the skills of the organization and the needs, and whether or not you need to look outside the organization to bring in certain consultancies or not. As you can see with the McKinsey model, it's a little bit more focused on you need to have each one of these pieces in place to achieve organizational change. So if you don't, you can go outside your organization and find it kind of very driven by a consultancy type model or approach. The AdCar model is more focused on a lens of viewing change by the identification of gaps in a process or training. So more focused on the employees and how they impact change. So the awareness for the need to change, and this is just AdCar is just an acronym. The desire to participate and support change. And you'll notice a lot of overlap between these models, just in the nature of how they're implemented. They don't all say the exact same thing, and they're coming from different lenses and different perspectives and contexts, but they do very much overlap. Knowledge on how to change, and that skills component that we might see from the McKinsey model. Ability to implement required skills or training, and then reinforcement to sustain the change. Monitoring. When we get to a little bit later on and start looking at some of the tools that one of my preferred BI tools uses, you can start to see this monitoring as being a really important part. And even in our example with Frank earlier, he went back and checked a couple of months later and realized that it wasn't actually being used. Maybe monitoring from the beginning could have helped him out a little bit more. And then the Kubler-Ross model, and this is more focused on what's known as the change curve. And I think everybody probably has seen this if you've ever heard about dealing with the different components of grief. This was introduced in a book that was focused on psychology a little bit more than organizational change, but they very much follow the same kind of path if you're introducing a new program or new prospects. I think anybody that's been in the energy business for the last 5 years, especially in Canada, has probably gone through a lot of these emotions, denial, shock, anger, bargaining, depression, and then finally acceptance. And somewhere along this line, maybe we're all trying to figure out where we fit with maybe energy, and hopefully there's an energy rebound and we don't have to even think about all this stuff anymore. But we've probably all seen this before. The time energy chart that exists when you're going through a change process that has to do with different levels of change. And you start off with denial, and you're really kind of focused on what's been wronged in the situation. You go through the facts that you're surprised that it even happened. You start to get angry that things would change or something's happened. Then you start to do a little bit of bargaining, and you kind of come off the energy curve as time progresses. And then after acceptance is the time where we start to rebound up. And there's an interesting little part in the middle here that's called the Valley of Despair. And it doesn't sound very good, and it sucks, but that's where people are kind of at their lowest of energy on this curve. But when you're in the valley, you recognize that you're always going to kind of come out of the other side. And this happens in projects as well, all the time. I've seen it happen with lots of IT implementations and data analytics projects. Is you get to that middle part where you've expended a lot of energy and a lot of time and a lot of resources, and it just doesn't feel like it's going anywhere. And I think it's really important for us in the data space to recognize that those are human emotions. We're all humans too, and people that are working on projects with us are all humans as well. And we kind of go through a lot of these phases the same way at the same time. So recognizing where we kind of are on this curve can help us identify, how are we going to approach this to get the ball rolling again, and not fall into the trap of we've hit this valley of despair and our projects kind of go off the rail. So what are the battles that we face, or at least that I see that we face in data? We've got accessibility, availability, deliverability, visibility, particularity, and then strategy. And I see it that we kind of map jobs to each one of these these battles that we can face. Architects look at the accessibility of data within an organization. Engineers focus on the availability of the data. We have developers, whether or not they're visual or Excel reports or crosstab reports, the delivery to key stakeholders. The visibility is the analysts. How do we take the data that's been delivered and produce it into what we're looking at for our business cases to make things better? The particularity is an interesting one, because I think that's where data scientists fit in. How does our data different? How do we create a competitive advantage with what we have compared to our industry or other people? And then the strategy is one that's not focused on a lot. I kind of always fall back to a Harvard Business Review article on not all jobs in data require data. To be perfectly honest, I think that's not the title, but that's the gist of the whole article. And it talks about data translators. And it's not necessarily a manager, it's not necessarily a leader. It's somebody that looks outside of the data space, the context of data, and looks at what are the problems of the business themselves, and then folds data back in on how to help solve those problems as a component or as a piece for solving that problem. And organizations are starting to pick up to this idea of a data translator. You might think of it more as like a data communicator that might be posted, or in the job applications, it might talk about somebody that can come in and teach data to the rest of the organization. That's a data translator, somebody that can take the concepts of data ideas from each one of the other members of the team, the architects, the engineers, the analysts, scientists, and developers, but help diffuse it within an organization. And so I'm going to, each one of these roles or each one of these components of data, we see change management as possibly, helping to translate these ideas or help share these ideas within an organization. Everyone that works with data faces these kind of challenges of communicating, out to a broader audience. So let's go through an example, or just an example where we could start to look at the model and how it might impact our thinking around developing a resource. So hypothetically, COVID's been going on now for a year, but hypothetically, when COVID started and there wasn't a lot of information that existed, what if a business leader asks you to say, we need to build a COVID sales recovery dashboard for once things start picking up again. We don't know how long our sales are going to be down, or we don't know how long our stores are going to be closed, but we want to develop the resource to be available so that when we start back up again, we understand where our product is going, where there's a lack of product that we need to help put from the distribution center, and what rails we need to exist to be able to get those things in place. So let's start off by looking at the AdCar model and awareness from that. Very big change in how business is done when COVID came around, especially for retail businesses or services, as well as in the energy space. Have business operations changed due to the pandemic? Just that simple question you can dive into and start to think and start to hash out, each one of the components of, well, are people now working from home? How are they getting data delivery? Are stores being closed or shut down or reduced hours? Are we shifting more to e-commerce? Are we seeing a pickup in that? Are there personal safety requirements? Basically, it comes down to who needs the data, when do they need the data, and how is it going to get consumed? And really, the encompassing idea here is, how is this different from the normal routines and habits? So how much change is going to be implemented when we're bringing in this new dashboard, and how are different components of the organization going to be affected by this change? That awareness that there's something is coming down the pipeline. It's not just a new dashboard you're creating. It's a new way for people to change is going to change their routines. And so a tip that I have in this space is, when you're starting off a new project or something that does require change from the normal routine or habits, you have a discussion and documentation of these types of topics or ideas that come up. Now, every project is going to be different. You're going to come up with a whole bunch of different things that might have changed or not changed, but you extensively talk and have documentation of these initial stages of this project. Number one, to get everybody aligned to why the project is actually happening. So you're implicitly starting to build coalitions or get people kind of rowing in the same direction. But just a simple establishment of a regular or weekly check-in meeting from the beginning of the project, even if it's 15 minutes, and even if it's only weekly or bi-weekly, that establishes a set time that key members, as people start to come into the project or come out of the project, start to recognize that this is going to be a sustained project that's going to be worked on. So in this new idea of a COVID sales recovery model, how can you go about building a guiding coalition now from the Cotters Model? So this is more where you have some institutional organizational experience, where you identify managerial and technical leaders with a vested interest in doing this. Not everybody is going to be needing a new dashboard. Maybe the people that are related to sales and distribution really, really need it. Maybe the financial aspect, or maybe the certain parts of the operations that only deal with the warehouse and ordering don't need it as much. But this can be, for example, retail leaders, distribution managers, marketing leads, supply chain analysts. It's good to get stock of who those people are, but also you want to see who, and to be perfectly honest, who wants to be seen in the project, versus who wants to be engaged in the project. And it's a fine line between who's being included just because they're being included in something that may be high profile, but between those people and the people that actually want to be engaged and help you build this coalition and go forward and develop something that is change related. It doesn't have to be explicit for a guiding coalition. It could just be individuals from different parts of the organization that you can fall back on and have a conversation with, a brief 10-minute coffee from within your organization to say, we're looking for this data set. Do you know anything about it, right? It's this networking effect. So my tip on this is to really build out your ability to utilize internal communication tools, especially working from home. We're using all of these tools now, and I think people have been able to become masters pretty quickly on things like Slack and Teams and Jira. We're using Zoom, obviously. But really, these project management tools are not just for managers. They're for people that are building out projects, and you can really fall back on them to not only disseminate information that exists as the project changes or evolves, but also to establish a little bit later, as I'm going to show, prioritization of the project and what's needed and what you have to go and find out, or if there's a barrier that comes up, such as removing roadblocks. Okay, let's look at structure from the McKinnon S7S model. Which teams and tasks take priority during the development? I'm sure everybody that's been involved in a project has had to deal with a lot of different relationships, especially as the project is bigger and maybe in more focus. What are the authority relationships that exist and decision complexities that exist within the organization? Who takes precedent when a decision needs to be made? And if you're new to an organization, or if you're relatively new to a role, you have to take the time to understand that. And you have to take, it's not an instantaneous, there's an org chart out there that exists that shows what the power authority, our network mapping diagram that shows you the authority of one person over another person. It's more of a implicit relationship that exists within organizations. So my tip on this is to study the org chart, understand where the different levels of people are, at least in a static view, because every company does put together an org chart and there's a reason behind it. But also to get to know the network of power within. And this comes from conversations and just subtle talking and communication within peers within the organization, especially people that have been around for a lot longer, people that have gone through project developments, maybe some that have failed, maybe some that have succeeded. Really leverage the people within your organization, even if you're new or even if you're more experienced, because they've seen things and they have a context in terms of these power relationships that you may not have seen before. And the last one I'll talk about here is bargaining. From the Kubler-Ross model, let's talk a little bit more kind of about the emotional side. Projects, if this is a COVID response for sales, it's probably a pretty high profile project. There's going to be lots of people involved. There might be C-suite and people that have kind of a view over top of it, but definitely kind of maybe senior leaders. And as the number of stakeholders grow, so does the number of asks. Some would say that it's exponentially. You've got it's a linear in the number of stakeholders, and then explodes for the number of asks that are required as the project gets going and built out. So how much flexibility in the project do we have for project creep? It's something that any creative project will go through. More and more asks for more and more dimensions. And I think what's very important to, again, leverage these tools that we have, these project management tools, and communicate and make them visible of what is crucial, what is needed, what is a want, and what is a wish. Sometimes in this data world, and especially on reports that we want to show off the power of the visualization tools, we really want to give everything. We want to develop this super beautiful dashboard that has all of these KPIs on it, but then there's an overwhelming of information that exists, and that might be a deterrent to actually use. And it's okay to push back on these ideas of what is crucial versus what is a wish. And it's almost vital for the sustainability of the project to say no to the wishes. It's really hard because right now, I know a lot of people in this particular session or this particular meetup, are working through looking for jobs or looking for employment, but thinking in the context of what bargaining has happened in your past lives as well, or past employment, how those relationships exist is also something that can give you leverage for going forward in the future at new positions. So my suggestion here is it's really important to develop a standardized project kickoff template, and one that starts to get used and reused and overused within an organization, because it helps people understand what's, again, crucial, what's needed, what is a want, and what is a wish. So my background in data actually is derived quite a bit from Tableau. I did quite a bit of development at WestJet in the Tableau space, both on the server and in the data visualization space. And then I went over and worked at Iteration Insights for about 9 months as their lead Tableau developer. And it's pretty telling to me that a lot of these BI tools, and Tableau I know just because I'm kind of plugged into that space, are starting to think of these data change management or these components of data change management as well. In the last year and a half, Tableau has brought out 2 new initiatives called the Blueprint and the Playbook for data change culture. And they borrow quite a bit of ideas and concepts from these models, these data change or these change management models, which were developed for broader business, but really can be distilled down to kind of the the data world as well for specific projects. And I would highly suggest going and taking a look at them. Not necessarily if you're more in the Python or R space, or you want to be more on the data architecture side. Tableau is not going to be the a particularly useful tool for you. But I think the fact that these organizations are starting to recognize that they can help guide businesses and organizations to instill data change management, it's really telling that it's going to become more and more vital that people can understand and translate these ideas into the workspace. So the next slide is going to be about that key component of data change management is communication with the employees. And I would argue that in the data space, we visualize really well at the end stage when we're reporting the analytics, or we're trying to produce dashboards that are really nice to look at and pretty. A big component of getting people on board, of progressing the steps of making a change, exist in the visualization space as well. We're visual people. Humans are visual animals for the most part. And I think all of us have seen this particular visualization of an ELT transformation. You've got an extract on the left-hand side of data source, you've got a transformation, and you've got a load. And this is a great visualization to bring to a business table and say, this is how our data goes through. For not necessarily people that are focused on data or have an analytics mindset. But we've seen this all a lot. And I think the next step to really start to get people on board with what we have to do is being brought to us by these tools as well. And I'm going to trot out one of Tableau's tools just to show how we can start to present data chain or data ELT in a different manner that may help the data change process, the communication aspect of it. So Tableau Prep Builder is a lot like Alteryx, if you've had experience with Alteryx, or as your data factory, or even the plug and drop components of some of the other ELT transformation tools. It's a UI-based business intelligence tool that has different components that you plug in to show the steps that you're going through to build a new data set. And what's nice about it is you can actually start to visualize what the components mean. And you can share this information more at a high level with people within the organization who aren't analytically focused to, again, get people kind of rowing all in the same direction and show how data is being merged and managed and manipulated through the process. What new KPIs are you creating? How are you determining different segmentations within it? Are you cleaning the data in a certain way? Those types of things go a long way for building, trust in building a new process or steps. And this actually popped up, funnily enough, on my my reading list a couple of days ago, and it's a relatively new book that's showing that it's starting to gain traction in the cultural space as well. There's a self-help reading recommendation for people skills for analytical thinkers. And I found this pretty interesting that it popped up on my reading list. But again, it's a whole book that's dedicated to how analytical thinkers are in one kind of mindset, and we have to think in different contexts. We have to get ourselves outside of our comfort zone to understand how other people within our organizations view and see what we see. And so I haven't read this book yet, but I'm quite interested, especially since the two figures on the front are very much representative kind of how I think myself and my wife view the world. But I'm going to come back again to that image that we see and that I showed at the very beginning of the presentation on what do you see when you're viewing data. And just to take that into context and take that into a viewpoint, because it's not just a good way to think about how we implement projects and how we implement change within our organizations, but also how somebody is seeing the data that we're trying to create and we're trying to visualize and we're trying to tell a story for. Ultimately with data, whether or not we're architects or whether or not we're engineers, developers, or visualizers or data scientists, we are telling a story with our data, or we're trying to validate a hypothesis, or we're trying to communicate an information, something that we see. We're trying to communicate it to other people within our organization to effectively change. And so that's my presentation. It's a general overview of the idea of data change management, and I'm perfectly happy to take questions now. I haven't seen any of the questions on the side of the Zoom meeting or not, but I think we're probably ready to go.
Great, Carter. Thank you so much. That was very insightful. And actually, that book I think might be very helpful for my marriage too, because we definitely think in different ways. So thanks for bringing that up. It might be more useful in life than at work for me. So one initial question, Lita's asking, does the Agile methodology fit in with any of the models you mentioned, or is it just a way of implementing some of these change management models?
I think the Agile model very much pulls from a lot of the different components of it. I wanted to focus on the real fundamentals that have come out in the last very early on in the whole process. But yeah, Agile is very much Agile, Lean, those kind of ideas very much draw from the foundations of these purposes. And I kind of distill Agile down to a lot of iteration, and then talking back with stakeholders, iterating more, talking. There's never a completeness to an Agile process. Even if you think you're done, there's always some more to be done with that. What I like about data change management as kind of not an opposite, but also parallel to Lean or Agile, is you focus on a completeness component of doing a data change management. There is a goal at the end, and you're building up slight little goals to get to that point, because I think we can get trapped in always trying to improve, but we work 80% of our way to get, what is it, 20% of our effort to get 80% of the way there, and then 80% of the effort to get the last 20% of the way there. We want to build a whole bunch of these 80% projects, right? Because that'll ultimately have the most impact on our organizations or ourselves.
Excellent, thank you. So Shabazz is asking, the AdCar model appears to be the most self-explanatory. Does the M7S model does it look like it's part of another larger model?
No, it's I would suggest going on and checking out the McKinsey, just Googling McKinsey 7S change management model. It really is self-contained from a standpoint of it looks at an organization as 7 components that are not, no one is stronger than the other, right? If you're going to institute change, each one of those components has to be looked at and focused on to be able to institute overall change. Again, think of it coming from what's the context of where that model was developed, and coming from is an overall large organizational change type model. You're bringing in a new Phoenix Pay operating system to your government or something like that. And so you want to make sure that each one of those components is taken care of. And because you want each one of those components taken care of, there's a very good chance that you as an organization do not have strength in 1, 2, 3, 4 of those components. So you're going to search for outside help, and McKinsey developed this model. So you're probably going to go, reference them or something along those lines. Again, very, very institutionalized, very broad level kind of ideas that, you're probably going to search out hope for.
And you gave quite a nice survey of these different models. Do you think that they're valid in certain contexts, certain industries should use the AdCar for this or the McKinsey one for that? What are your feelings on that?
I like the idea that we are adaptive in analytics, probably more so than a lot of other organizations. Pick and choose, be knowledgeable that they exist out there. There will be some that will be much more beneficial to your particular role or job or trying to implement a certain project. A big one, again, removing barriers. And a lot of managers talk about roadblocks. It's built into their lexicon. Roadblocks is removing barriers to achieving a goal kind of thing. What can I do to help you do that? Another big one is for most of them is celebrating small victories. We have a goal in mind. Your project manager comes to you and says, I want this dashboard in 2 months, right? I'm actually going to go back to the example. Frank was myself, by the way, just in case nobody caught that. But, you don't win all the time. You don't always succeed, but you have little successes along the way. And if you can communicate that to your broader audience, to the users, to the stakeholders within an organization, you're going to find a lot more successes. And even if you don't succeed fully, if you don't hit that home run on what you think you're going to hit a home run on, now you've celebrated a bunch of successes with other people in your organization who will be more inclined to join you in the next opportunity, or you'll be willing to join them in the next opportunity. This enlisting an army of volunteers is not just about the project itself, but support around a project, or finding, who's within an organization that might be able to help you with other things too. It's building out a network.
Yeah, I find within my team, we've employed JIRA and the Agile methodology. And I find that it's very nice because we do these tiny little things all the time that feel like you never get anywhere. But at least when you look back, you have this documented proof that you actually have built a little mountain out of, sand grains. It's quite a nice feeling.
I find with JIRA, it's interesting because it really is self-contained. For the I don't know how it's implemented at Cenovus, but the two implementations that I've had with JIRA is you're very much looking at it from a project management standpoint of the IT space. Mm-hmm. It's not a particularly great communication tool to others unless you bring people into that world, right? They can't just check in on a project. Yeah. So I've actually seen really good implementations of project timelines and Gantt, if you will, into something like Tableau, which can disseminate out to a bunch of different stakeholders.
Yeah, that sounds great, because that's what I actually built. I built a custom project tracking tool in order to communicate that out, and Jira is just kind of like the back end that allows us to kind of keep our work on track. So that's great. Happy to hear that. So who should lead in implementing changes like this? Should it be change management people, business analysts, the CEO? Where should that drive come from?
Yeah, I'll be honest. Most of the change that probably happens comes from somebody that's a champion within the organization for data. So if you are trying to lead a lot of these initiatives, the ground up approach is really hard, I would say, in data, just because there's not a lot of shared values from the data space, if you will. But if you have somebody at the top who's receptive within kind of a senior management level, or VP, that you can really attach to and start to drive these, it helps out a lot. It's very beneficial to have somebody who is a supporter or champion at the top level, whether or not that's with the specific BI tool, whether or not it's Power BI or the Microsoft stack, whether or not it's a data warehouse cloud implementation, if you're going to go AWS or Azure or Snowflake, or whether or not it's actually implementing new analytical tools in the ML space, right? It's right now, I would say, especially in Canada, just because of maybe more of our conservative corporate nature, getting people on board would require more of that authoritative figure. So getting people on board might include having lunch and learns within your organization, where you are doing presentations, getting out of your your comfort zone to start to bring in individuals that will self-assess themselves, or there's a concept called negative weeding, where you basically throw a ton of information out there to a whole bunch of different stakeholders, and people that respond are people that are generally interested, right? It actually is the basis for kind of the Nigerian prince scam, right? You throw 100,000 or 1 million emails out there, and the people that respond are kind of the most gullible, right? So you've automatically weeded out people that are going to ask the most questions. The same thing could be implemented with data change management. Throw out a ton of invitations to a lunch and learn on any topic that interests you, and then see who shows up, right? And then use those people as the foundation for your coalitions, for your networking.
And I could be known as the scam artist at Cenovus. That sounds great.
Aren't you already, Mark? Oh,
probably. We actually did go through that process a couple of years ago, and it was quite interesting seeing the types of people that were coming to some of our talks. Right, it was quite fascinating. Folks I wouldn't have expected, and I think that's really key. You don't know who's really interested in this, right, until you ask.
And yeah, you're identifying nodes within the network, right? Because you've I don't know if you've ever seen a true network organization diagram before, of people that had connections within an organization. It's really hard to do. It's really hard for, number one, a sign off on doing a nodal examination of an organization, especially with large organizations. But it's really interesting to see you have these underlying connectors within an organization that have maybe been there a long time, maybe not, but they're just really good at making relationships, and they can help build out your coalition without you even knowing it. And you won't be able to understand that network because it's kind of a hidden network. And like you said, throw out ideas around data, throw out a data-thon idea, or like you guys, you started out as a data-thon idea, and you see who shows up to those organizations, and then you can really build a community around that.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's a fascinating process. Carrie would like to know, with so many companies siloed, what seems to be the most difficult obstacle with change management?
I think getting people to the bargaining table is a big one. It's really hard to get people in the same room, and especially where there's a meeting culture that exists, where you're kind of 90, 80, 70% of your time is in meetings that people have set up. And I think one of the biggest kickstarters to starting to bring in a true data organization or data culture organization is to get people okay with canceling out of meetings that they're not supposed to be in. And if you get invited to a meeting, you have this feeling of obligation that you need to go, when in reality, I think this is where it comes from the organization, from the top down. If they recommend, if your senior leaders recommend, you've been invited to all of these meetings, if you don't think you provide value to it, or you're just there to talk, or your 2 cents or something along those lines, getting an organization to get over the meeting hump is a big step towards starting to bring in a data culture, because they might not seem related to begin with, but you're giving people more time to actually start to think about the contextualized ideas, and you're starting to get people involved in making decisions for themselves. To be perfectly blunt and honest, we get kind of stuck into these routines, these norms. Giving people the option to opt out of meetings because they feel like they don't need or add value to it. That's adding to that step of, self-responsibility.
And so, thank you. And Wayne is asking about that contextualized data. You mentioned a bit earlier on and you just touched on it now. Can you elaborate a little further on that?
Contextualized data, as in, what I would say, how do people view data from different parts of the organization, whether or not I'll give an example. It's very hard to get people off of pivot tables. Very hard to get people off of pivot tables, because from Excel, and almost everybody that's been in a work environment has had to go through Excel if they're doing data. And we just keep adding on to the layers of what Excel is. But ultimately, it comes back to aggregating data in a sense that people understand, and then them copying it again to do more analysis based off of that. And the contextualized component of where do they view data from an Excel standpoint? How do you shift or nudge them away from that? There was a whole talk that I listened to last year about nudging in visualization and data visualization, including an aggregate table in your visualization behind the scenes, so that somebody is comfortable that it's there, just mentally. You have the crosstab. It exists, but don't use the crosstab. We have something better, right? You're not taking away their ability to see a crosstab. It still exists. You can access it, but you have to take one extra step. You have to click one extra point to get to that crosstab. You're kind of nudging somebody towards more of, here's how the data can be presented in different manners, and you're starting to find new insights out of it. I hope that answered your question. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I find that quite insightful, because whenever I do build a dashboard, I always have a little data table tab off to the side that says, hey, the data's there, don't worry, and you can take a look at it if you like, but let's see what we can do with it.
Yeah, I find another thing that's really useful for engaging the audience. We're in an interesting space, because we see data, we collect data, we build these visualizations, but we ultimately don't see how a user is using it, unless you get them to map their eye tracking across the screen or their mouse clicks, and that's just above and beyond a level that I'm willing to go to for all of that, personal space and all that stuff. But including things like a user guide of how to use the visualization, or a key to show you what KPIs are involved in this, or to have an overall landing page for the reports that you've created. Now you're starting to contextualize who's using your data or their data, and personalizing it a little bit more. So, you have a landing page that everybody kind of goes to start, and here's the operation in the top left corner, here's all the operation reports. Top right corner, you've got all your, distribution reports. You've got your sales reports your finance reports on the bottom. And by the way, finance is one of the hardest people to get away from crosstabs and Excel. You need to use a lot more components of your change management model to get people going into different things from the crosstabs there. But a landing page which kind of defines directionality to where the data is going. The data behind all of these reports may be exactly the same. You might have a couple of extracts or cubes that you're using to build all these reports, but you're giving people context for directionality of where they're going to use it and where they're going to go with it.
Well, thank you. I was busy taking notes here for my next Agile meeting. Thank you for that. So we'll wrap this up shortly. Just a quick question. You just started a new role, and hopefully it's going well so far. But what are some of the quick wins you've been able to generate so far?
Oh, some of the quick wins is to the reports I would say that already existed within the organization. It helps that I had built them as the consultant that existed at the consultancy firm before they hired me on at the job. So a quick win personally was that I got hired by the client. So I would suggest to people out there as well is don't look past the kind of small consultancy gigs that you might be able to get, even if it's on a small contract. There's connections that exist within those, and you get to develop your skill set and see how this remote working world really works. Because remote working, you don't have to just work here in Calgary, you don't have to work in Vancouver, or you don't have to work in you could work for a small consultancy firm out of Toronto that does data analytics, and then that might open up a whole bunch of doors. So getting in with gigs can really kind of open a bunch of networking opportunities. But a really quick win that I'm really quite proud about is as soon as I started working with the actual company with Chatters, I started to implement I would call them notifications on the data sources. So a report is sent out in the morning that's on a subscription, and it has on it, whether or not the data was late, whether the data was loaded, what time the data was loaded, how much data was loaded, just as a little visual marker that would give confidence to the stakeholders that the data is there. I can just go on with my day. I don't have to worry about waiting a couple hours in case the data load is late, because that's another thing that we face all the time is when there's an error that happens with data that's loaded in, the velocity that we've got data coming in on a regular basis, there's a lot of things that can happen in our ELT processes with a bunch of different systems. So just to have confidence that the underlying foundations of our data is accurate, quick, and on time is a big lifesaver when you're starting to try and do some of these other projects as well.
Excellent. Taking more notes here. Thank you. And so you've been in a number of different industries now. How does that feel?
I'm really trying not to kill the hair industry. I'm sorry, guys. So I was in energy when there was 2015, and then the airline space, which unfortunately is even, you and I actually share that, Mark, that yes, we were both in the airline space in very different times. But I can't believe that my wife keeps telling me that I've killed 2 industries so far, and I really hope that I don't get the hair industry.
I went through a bankruptcy in the airline industry, so yeah, I think I have that same Grim Reaper feel to my career as well. So when you move through these different industries, do you find how much do you need to know about the industry before you feel comfortable?
Really good question. I think you need to know, just to kind of reframe that, I think you need to know about yourself a lot and what you see within organizations and how you approach. Data is data, and to be perfectly honest, if you can build your case study of yourself, build your story of yourself through data. One of the things that really benefited me when I was coming out of my MBA and starting to look at the analytics space was, what do I find interesting and how do I tell a story about that? How can I go and meet people and say, look, I've used these tools. I have a case study that I built up, about myself. Maybe it's personal data. I'm hoping. I've been tracking my coffee drinking for the last six weeks, and gosh, I drink way too much coffee. But I'll visualize that at some point because it's something that's personal. It's something that's interesting that you can relate on, and just being enthusiastic about what you bring to the table, I think really helps out a lot. Yeah, data is data, and the systems behind where you are, where you're at. I would say oil and gas is quite a bit different than the other places that I've been, just because it's so specialized, right? Like, I mean, seismic, for instance, or seismic processing is a very specialized case of data science that has been built up over time. And, there's a lot of processes that were already figured out by, we're standing on the shoulders of giants when we do geophysical processing and geophysical interpretation. A lot of the hard work was done beforehand. So getting away from that, it was really interesting to get from such a specialized world where you kind of knew the levers that you could turn and what would change when you turned those levers, getting into other data spaces. There is a lot more opportunity. So, find your story, tell your story, figure out what your story is, and it will fit somewhere within the data world of organizations, because, all of those jobs that I pointed out before, each one may be a little bit more specialized than the other one. The architects, the engineers, they're all storytellers, all of them.
Well, that's great. Thank you so much. We're coming up on the hour, and we'd like to wrap up and make sure everybody has a great evening. Thank you so much, Carter. Really appreciate all the insights and a very unique spin on the data space. And I've taken away a lot, and I'll have to rewatch this a few times to glean all the wisdom that you provided.
Well, I appreciate it. Thanks for asking me here. It's something that, I've been kind of mulling around in my mind for a little bit. And, I've made the point before that don't hesitate to borrow from other people in the data space. We need to do a better job of borrowing what's worked really well in other parts of business. And change management has been a success for a long time. We can definitely take key components of it to make our lives easier.